Another Arnold Freberg painting that you might recognize is this one of Mosiah chapter 18, which is Alma baptizing at the waters of Mormon. Alma was a priest of Noah, and he's defected because he's believed the words of Abinadi and run away from King Noah. The text tells us that he takes the words of Abinadi, he starts preaching privately to other people, and he gathers them at this mountain lake where they baptize each other, and he then establishes a covenant of Christ with them as they understand a formation of a pseudo-church. We are also then introduced to another character called Helam, which we don't know a lot about, but somehow close to Alma. And these two baptize each other in this symbolic covenant that they're making with God. And as the group gets larger and more conspicuous, they flee from Noah as a king and end up in another place, which they name Helam after this other character. They establish a tranquil community, and their peace is disturbed when the Lamanites find them and basically ask for their help to get back to the land of Noah. And in the process, they put Amulon, a priest of Noah who's also defected, above them, and this Amulon, oppresses them, knows Alma from his time on the court, and effectively persecutes him till the Lord delivers them and enables them to flee to the land of Zarahemla and reunite with Mosiah. There's a lot going on here, and if this is related to Joseph Smith Jr. and his relationship with his father, there are some interesting clues and maybe some opportunities to reverse engineer the Book of Mormon at this point and understand some of the things that are going on in Joseph's life after he leaves Palmyra and goes back down to the Bainbridge, Colesville, and Harmony area. One of the issues we have is we don't have a lot of information about Joseph when he's not in Palmyra, and Lucy gives such a kind of glowing and detailed examination of what's happening with the family. We do know that after the Harmony dig and the problems that are happening in Manchester, Palmyra, that Joseph goes back down to the area, and he's there basically from the beginning of 1826 right through to the beginning of 1827 when he elopes with Emma in January, and then they get relocated back to Manchester. We know from Joseph Knight Sr. that he first stayed with Josiah Stoll. And then there's court records in March of 1826 where he's held for glass looking in that area. And Josiah Stoll's nephew is worried that he is being taken advantage of and presses Joseph with charges, and Joseph is arrested and questioned. It does appear from trial testimony that he initially does treasure digging with Josiah Stoll when he first gets down to the area. But it does appear that he stopped treasure digging after the trial and that he went to school for a certain amount of time. Now, this may have been that he was trying to improve himself drastically, because in his courting of Emma, Isaac Hale said that he thought he was not that great, and so Joseph was trying to up his educational standards. And we have so little information about this. We don't know what Joseph's proficiency was or how much he increased during that 1826 year. But Joseph Knight Sr. says that Joseph came and lived with him later in 1826, and he helped him with transport back and forth to see Emma till they got married, and Josiah Stoll moved them to Manchester in January of 1827. When Emma reconciled with her family later in 1827, Peter Ingersoll, a neighbour, had taken Joseph and Emma to Harmony, and he reports that, of course, Isaac Hale was incredibly upset about the fact that his daughter had been stolen, but he also called out Joseph for money digging and suggested that he was a fraud. Joseph told his father-in-law that he would mend his ways. And Peter Ingersoll reports that Joseph said on the way home that this would be really difficult for him because the people in Palmyra would want him to continue to be a treasure digger, and that would be very hard not to do under their pressure. So it might be that Joseph is recalling this oppression in the story where Alma is in Helam being under the oppression of Amulon, and the idea that he has to keep money digging, but he doesn't want to, and he's quietly converted. And it may be this idea of Alma privately going about with the words of Abinadi is Joseph not trying to alert his father to the fact that he's had a change of heart. Joseph recalls much later in his 1838 history that at some point in his life he was partial to the Methodists, and this may have been his desire to unite with the Hale family. Emma's cousins recount a time which seems to be after the loss of the manuscript in July-August of 1828, that Joseph presented himself to the Methodist Church in the area with the idea that he wanted to join. And they basically kicked him out because he was a practicing necromancer, conversing with spirits, because he's working on the Book of Mormon up until this point. When Joseph moved from Palmyra through to Harmony, this may have felt like an escape from the oppressive money diggers and as an opportunity to work on the Book of Mormon, but also practice his Christianing faith. And of course, this is all being written in April of 1829 as Joseph is dictating Mosiah through to his scribe Oliver Cowdery. And I've talked before about how Oliver is probably more Christian than Joseph and is thinking about these things in terms of a church. And so that's why we see this formation of a pseudo-church in Helam. And maybe Oliver is that guy, Helam, that Alma unites with. When Alma and Helam get baptized, they immerse each other in the water as a sign of the baptism that they're both having for the first time. And this actually happens to Joseph and Oliver a little bit later in May of 1829, May 15th actually, because we know from Lucy that they get a instruction in the seer stone and they go down to the Susquehanna River and they bury each other in the water, just like Alma and Helam have done in Mosiah chapter 18. There doesn't seem to be any indication that Joseph is practicing Christianity in 1826 in that Harmony, Colesville, Bainbridge area, or that he is doing that so much in 1827, although the idea that he's doing it privately may be the case. So it's hard to tell whether that Mosiah 18 baptism type thing is happening to Joseph, or that he's preaching and converting others during this time frame. We don't seem to have any indication of that. So it may be wishful thinking, or it may be a type of things that he's thinking about now that Oliver Cowdery's the scribe in 1829, or maybe just an idea of a Christian adventure story rolling forward with these types connected to Christianity. It's really hard to dissect. And this is the most speculative part of this whole understanding of Alma as Joseph Smith Jr. But at the end of the story, Alma flees Helam, gets to Zarahemla, reunites with Mosiah, and Mosiah gives him charge to establish churches in the land of Zarahemla. It seems weird that there aren't any churches in Zarahemla already, but this seems to be the feature of this idea that now this work, this Christian conversion, is leading to ideas of churches, even in the loosest form of community. And it's at this point that the king's rhetoric finishes in the book of Mosiah and Judges take over, and Mosiah and Alma die around the same period of time, which suggests we're into another understanding of the autobiographical makeup of the Book of Mormon. The ending of the Book of Mosiah is quite interesting because it has some autobiographical parts, but it also suggests that there's some development in the text, some understandings which are being furthered, probably because of the audience. This combining of the agendas of both Alma and King Mosiah are really key to understanding this, because I think these two parts of Joseph are now combining, and they're looking forward to the future of this project with regard to the Book of Mormon. We see both characters, Alma and King Benjamin, talk on the same subject in a univocal way. Here is a side-by-side of Mosiah chapter 23 and Mosiah 30. Mosiah chapter 23 is Alma describing to his people in Helam why they shouldn't have a king, and using Noah as the example of a wicked king, that you just can't trust kings. They will go off, and if there's a good king, that might work well for you, but if there's a wicked king, this is going to work particularly badly. Alma gives a whole treatise about this, and then Mosiah gives the same treaty, just expanded in Mosiah chapter 30, whereby Mosiah then advocates for the idea of judges going forward, and that they should end the line of kings. And maybe this is a sign of a shift in Joseph's priorities with regard to the dictation process, the idea of the line of kings, into a more spiritual line of prophets. And this probably mirrors 1828, when Joseph goes from feeling like he's in charge of everything to his dark night of the soul, which means that he has to recommit himself to God and recommit the project of the Book of Mormon to a spiritual endeavor. We see this particularly with Mosiah chapter 27, which is the story about the sons of Mosiah and the son of Alma, who are fighting against God, the rising generation, and they are stopped by an angel. This angel appears to them and shakes them to their very core. Alma is given a warning and basically struck down. He's on his deathbed or in some kind of a trance. And when he comes to, he talks about how he's been changed, that he's repented, that he's seen the Lord in vision or dream, and he's been born again. And this becomes the understanding going forward. So again, this biblical born again being inserted into the text at the end of Mosiah. Mosiah 27 is basically Alma and these four sons of Mosiah with this great change of heart, who then go zealously trying to publish peace and rectify the things that they have done wrong in their previous life. And this is probably how Joseph felt in late 1828. Things got really hard, and he's got to rededicate himself to the project in a spiritual way. The idea that he's leading people to Christ, not just talking about overcoming. And we see in Mosiah chapter 28, Mosiah taking these records that he's got from Limhi and translating them using those two stones, those seer stones. And it's given an account of the people of Jared from the Tower of Babel. And we see in verse 19 the idea that this account is going to be given. And this doesn't ever happen. I guess Joseph thought that this was going to happen. But again, we got to 3rd Nephi, and then things changed. The project needed to finish, and so it finished with 4th Nephi, and this account never came to pass. So this is what I think is happening when Joseph gets to Fayette and the Whitmers read Mosiah, and they're like, oh wow, we're going to hear about this ancient group of people from the Tower of Babel. Wow, that's going to be amazing. And Joseph's like, oh gosh, I haven't done that yet. We need to do the Book of Ether. Then King Mosiah gives all of the records to the newly converted Alma the Younger, who then takes those records onto the priestly or prophetic line of the Book of Mormon going forward. And that's how we get this combination of the converted Alma and the King Mosiah transferring into Alma's line of prophetic priestly influence as the work changes more to this rhetoric of conversion. In finishing up Mosiah, it's probably worth going right back to the very start and talking about the progression of Mosiah, because a lot has happened in this short time period of this dictation. Mosiah actually starts with King Benjamin giving a speech to his flock, his kingdom, but also as a spiritual leader to his people. And it mirrors Second Great Awakening camp revival meetings, including the towers and the tents. Because in Mosiah chapter 2, He asks the people to assemble together. They bring their families and they have their tents with their doors to the tower so that they can hear King Benjamin. And he erects a tower so he can get up high so people can see him. But then he also writes down his words, which are then sent out to the fully literate people. And because he's at the end of his life, he wants to rid his garments of their blood or their sins so that he can go to heaven and be in the presence of a just God. In his sermon, he talks about how little children are blessed and that the atonement takes care of them, so that the infant perisheth not in his infancy. And this seems to be a direct reference to Joseph and Emma's firstborn son, Alvin, which had died in June of 1828. It's quite possible that Emma Smith was scribing for Joseph during this chapter, so this was especially pertinent and directed at her. Chapter 4 identifies a camp revival conversion experience where the people are overcome by the words of the preacher and they fall on the ground because they're convicted because of their sins and they seek for forgiveness from Jesus. And they know that they have received a remission of sins because they have such great joy because they're filled by the Spirit. And King Benjamin assures them that if they keep on top of that sense of nothingness and their worthless and fallen state and attached to the atonement that and trust in God's good grace, that they will continually be saved. That by calling on the Lord daily, they can access this understanding and spirit. And that's it. There is no baptism in the beginning of the book of Mosiah. King Benjamin does not teach about baptism because this wasn't a part of many camp revival spiritual conversions. So when we get to Mosiah chapter 18, where Alma's baptizing alongside Helam, or in Alma chapter 27, when Alma the younger is then getting conversions experience and utilizing the term born of God and born of the water and the Spirit, these things are things that are happening later in the book of Mosiah as the book becomes more spiritual and heads towards the formation of a church. These seem like things that Oliver is injecting into the conversation because he firmly believes that a church is necessary and possible. King Benjamin does not talk about this type of conversion, nor the idea of a church, and there isn't a church in King Mosiah's time frame. Mosiah chapter 4 also talks about imparting of your substance to the poor, that if somebody comes to you with a petition, you should not withhold your substance, but you should give freely. And this seems to correlate really strongly with Martin Harris, who comes to Harmony, Pennsylvania in March of 1829, desiring a witness of the plates, which he doesn't get. We know this from Doctrine and Covenants section 5. But one of the things that Joseph is in need of is sustenance. He's in need of support, particularly financially, because the Hales have stopped supporting the family and he's destitute. And so I think this is part of what he's asking from Martin, but doing it via the Book of Mormon. And at the same time, just a few verses later, he talks about returning something that you have borrowed. And this seems like another reference directed at Martin as he's scribing this particular chapter, that he has to give back the lost pages. At this point in Joseph's life, he believed Martin is a wicked man, that he's withholding the lost manuscript as a way of testing Joseph. And so it's really interesting to see these real-time events playing out in the text of the Book of Mormon, and then, of course, the development even within just that Book of Mosiah as Oliver Cowdery comes to be the scribe. This is a good indication of how dynamic the Book of Mormon text is and how reliant it is on the audience, and particularly the person who is taking down the words that Joseph is orating in the moment. The change to the book of Alma is a significant one. It suggests a change in agenda, a new regime and understanding, and certainly this is the case with Alma because he is now the first chief judge. He's going to be an elected official effectively, and he's going to rule the people through law and a system of judges rather than by kingdom and appointment. It's worth looking at the header to the Book of Alma, because this is a good indication of what this book is supposed to achieve. And basically, it's about the reign of the judges and about the wars of the Nephites and the Lamanites. And also Alma as the high priest of the church, because he's fulfilling two different significant roles. So there's this political landscape, and then there's also this religious landscape, and they're all centered around Alma. The Book of Mosiah doesn't have this header because the Book of Mosiah, the first part of it was lost with the lost manuscript, so we don't have that. But we have a few insertions in the Book of Mosiah that tell us about what's going to happen, and the Book of Alma has this. And then, of course, the scope of the Book of Alma is actually bigger than this introduction would suggest, and so there has to be new insertions, new headers in the balance of the text, and I'll try and point them out as we go, because that gives us an understanding of how the project is changing in real time. Chapter 1 starts out with this understanding of spiritual danger, represented by this man called Nehor, who is effectively an antichrist. He's speaking against the church. He's forming his own anti-church, and he's gathering a lot of people. And one of the understandings of this Nehor character is that he's supported by the people, and this goes against what has been taught in Mosiah and what is going to be taught in the rest of this chapter, that priests should be paid, and this is priestcraft. The Book of Mosiah has made a real point that religious leaders should work alongside their flock and not fleece them. One of the great cross references in this chapter is that to Gideon, who is the hero in Mosiah chapter 19, and Nehor slays him after they battle around spiritual matters. I think this gives us some great clues to some autobiographical content, because Gideon is Lucy Mack Smith, and she's a Congregationalist. She's joined the Presbyterian church. She's going to church. She's engaging in the religious life of a church. And her husband, Joseph Smith Sr., is not. He's a Universalist, and this becomes a huge contention in lots of families in early 19th century America, but it's certainly on the religious landscape, the idea that religionists believe that they will be taken care of and everything will be all right for them in the end, because that's what Jesus suffered for, and Jesus is not God. He's just a instrument of God, and yet those who are participating in organized religions or more Calvinist understandings like Presbyterians believe that Jesus is God and is needed to save them. So this contention between Nehor and Gideon, I think, is autobiographical. It's a contention in the Smith household between mother Lucy and father Joseph Smith Sr. Alma judges against Nehor and suggests that this priestcraft is the thing that's going to bring people to utter destruction. Now, this doesn't happen, and Joseph gets some new ideas about what utter destruction might mean and how it might come about. But at this point, at the beginning of Alma, utter destruction is being linked to this idea of false understanding of Jesus and church embodied in universalism. So Alma judges Nehor and puts him to death. And Nehor, before he dies, says that he's been deceived. And one thing that's interesting is that Nehor, as a name for this man, doesn't come up till almost till his death in this particular section. And we see this just a lot through the Book of Mormon, particularly in this early times where there needs to be a new character, and the character is introduced, but the name is not given till a little bit later. And that seems like Joseph has got a thought and has introduced it, but then needs to go and find a name. So this happens with the sons of Mosiah. They're introduced with Alma persecuting the church, and then it's not until the very end of the story that they're then named, and this also happens with Nehor. And it's said in verse 15 that he suffers an ignominious death, which in 19th century America meant getting hanged. But this didn't put down this new religious movement. It just seemed to percolate it. And then we see in the next chapter that this order of Nehor becomes a threat to the people. Milicy, who becomes a fighter against democracy in chapter 2 is part of the same order or part of the same church. And this threat goes on through the next few chapters of the Book of Mormon, and we're going to hone in on one of them specifically shortly. One of the significant missionary companionships is that of Alma and Amulek. Alma eventually gave up his chief judge position to preach full-time, and he had mixed success. In one city that he went to, he was really rejected, and he was told to go back by an angel, and he met Amulek, who was prepared by an angel to receive him. Together they witnessed against the people, particularly those lawyers and judges who were of the order of Nehor, and converted one of their own, Zeezrom, who became quite an avid teacher and believer in their words. Alma and Amulek were cast into prison, and they were able to escape by the power of God and convert more people. I think Joseph is combining a number of events in his early life in that kind of Harmony, Colesville, Bainbridge area, and it's seeping into the text. That initial summary that we saw at the beginning of Alma doesn't last long. We get another heading in chapter 5, and then this one in chapter 7, and this one in chapter 9. Alma is taken care of by Amulek and fed and sheltered. And this seems to mirror an account that Joseph Knight Sr. talks about with regard to Joseph Smith, and the idea that Joseph Smith is pretty lowly, doesn't have any provisions, and he goes to Joseph Knight Sr., and Joseph Knight Sr. is able to give him some things. Joseph Knight Sr. is supposed to be a man of means, and he feels called of God to help Joseph. Zeezrom contends with them, and you can see from the arguments that Zeezrom is making that he's making some arguments against God being singular and all-encompassing. This is precisely the contention between the Universalists and the Calvinists in early 19th century America. But Amulek is able to withstand Zeezrom's questions, and they cause Zeezrom to doubt. And Zeezrom, who is convicted of his sins, stands up for Alma and Amulek. We learn in Alma chapter 14 that the lawyers and judges are of the faith of Nehor, and this fits in line with their understanding that they are Universalists. And I think Zeezrom here is actually Joseph Smith Sr. We know from Joseph Knight Sr.'s account that Joseph Smith Sr. came to see Joseph Knight on the way to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to visit his son. And in that trip in February of 1829, Joseph got a revelation for his father, including telling him that he could preach. And this is Doctrine and Covenants section 4. This is a major conversion for Joseph Smith Sr., who is now getting revelation and guidance from Joseph, his son. Zeezrom, who is convicted of his sins and on his deathbed, is healed by Alma. And it seems that Joseph Smith Sr. is having a huge change of heart predicated on his understanding and his belief in his son Joseph. Alma baptizes Zeezrom, and he goes from that time forth to preach unto the people. And that's kind of what happens with this revelation that Joseph gets for his father in Doctrine and Covenants section 4, that he's called to preach the gospel. Also embedded in this story is the idea that Alma and Amulek are put into prison. Now, this happens to Joseph. He gets into trial in 1826, and he is released seemingly under, good circumstances, because Josiah Stoll, argues for him. And one of the things we learn is that Amulek has forsaken his family. And we know from Joseph Knight Sr.'s account, initially his family were really upset and would not support him in helping Joseph. And so actually the idea that Amulek had a conflict with his family and Joseph Knight Sr. had a conflict with his family over the preaching of the word, this is really good comparison and correlation. So Alma takes Amulek back to Zarahemla and administers to him in his house. In Joseph Knight Sr.'s account, he actually goes to Harmony, Pennsylvania, and helps Joseph and Oliver with provisions. But we do have a revelation to Joseph Knight Sr. in May of 1829, which is Doctrine and Covenants section 12, and this is that charge to preach that he is called of God, and very much like Amulek is set out to teach the people. And while the connections are not quite as strong as we've seen them so far, I think that this is a compilation experience, few different events with Joseph Knight Sr. that are wrapped up into one. And that conversion of Zeezrom, or the conversion of Joseph Smith Sr., is a really big, important step of Joseph becoming the prophet leader of his family. And it explains why we have the wicked King Noah being Joseph Smith Sr., and then Lehi being righteous being Joseph Smith Sr., and here we've got that bridge in between, which is Joseph Smith Sr. repenting and getting revelation from his son. There is not a lot of autobiographical material in the rest of the Book of Alma, but there are some things that are worth looking at. Firstly, we have these quests. The 4 sons of Mosiah go out to teach the Lamanites and to acquire them, bring them back to the Lord. And that seems very much like other treasure quests that we've seen already in the Book of Mormon with regard to Lehi's 4 sons who have gone out to get the gold plates and get wives from Ishmael. And the idea of 4 sons is very common across the Book of Mormon. We also see that in the Book of Ether with the sons of Jared, and some other examples in both Mosiah and the Book of Alma, which suggests that Joseph is using treasure digging lore and those quests that he's gone on with his companions in his money digging days into the narratives of the Book of Mormon and crafting them as spiritual acquisitions. One of the other areas that I think we can point to is that in Harmony, Pennsylvania, Joseph is closely aligned and connected to Emma's Hale family and their cousins, the Lewises. Nathaniel Lewis is a Methodist preacher of the time, and he is Emma's uncle. The Hale and Lewis families are dedicated Methodists, and so this is a major part of their interaction and connection in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And Joseph never talks about this particularly, and the few accounts that we have from those families in later 1833, 1834 give us snippets of their interactions with Joseph, but not a lot of detail. One of those accounts that we've already looked at is from Hale Lewis, a cousin, who in 1879 talks about how Joseph tried to join the local Methodist church, and this was likely after the loss of the manuscript. But he is rebutted and basically cast out. Nathaniel Lewis, in his statement, talks about how Joseph and him often used to talk, and that in one occasion that Joseph asked him if he should give up the Gold Bible project. And there are echoes in the text of the Book of Mormon for these events. Being cast out of Emma's family's Methodist church is a really big deal, and this seems to make its way into Alma chapter 32, where Alma is having more success around the poor class of people who have been cast out of the synagogues because of the coarseness of their apparel. Alma, after having been asked what shall we do, gives them a formula for having church or the gospel in their own lives, in their own hearts, making the case that God should be in their lives every single day, not just once a week. And to feel grateful for their humility, that their humility has brought them to God. And giving a contrast between those who have come to the Lord because of their meekness and those who profess to be religious and yet are not doing the will of God. And you can imagine that this describes how Joseph is feeling about the Hale and Lewis family and their religiosity, particularly their Methodism, when it doesn't actually translate into helping the poor. And we have various accounts, particularly from Joseph Knight Sr., that the Hale family were not supporting Emma and Joseph, and so they were in destitution and they had to ask for help. And so this is really mirroring their circumstance in late 1828 and through into early 1829. Alma gives this treatise in Alma chapter 32 about planting your seed and having it grow, and the idea that this will be a evidence that God is working with you. And then you'll get this fruit, this white fruit. And this harkens back to that understanding of the tree of life, which we also talked about with regard to Lehi's vision, which was Joseph Smith Sr.'s vision. And there is that admonition in Alma chapter 34 against those who profess religion and they are not helping the needy, because this is absolutely Joseph and Emma's situation. There is also a concern in Alma 35 that because Alma is preaching these egalitarian ideals, that this is destroying the work of priestcraft, those who are over churches and getting their income derived from preaching. And so now the people are getting angry and they're stirring up the Lamanites to go to war against the people of God. And this is what kind of happens in Harmony, Pennsylvania. Joseph and Oliver have to leave by the end of May because things are just getting so hard. Joseph Knight Sr. describes the event that the people are mocking Joseph over his translation of the Book of Mormon. That's why he's had to hide the records in the mountains, because he just can't deal with the intrusiveness. Because remember, the Smith's cottage is right on the main road. You have to go past Isaac Hale's house and right past the front door of Emma and Joseph. And as people are becoming aware of Oliver Cowdery and the scribing, they're stopping in to look at this spectacle. And then we have Alma counseling his 3 sons, who then are going to take forward the work. One of Alma's sons has done something terrible. He's supposed to be a missionary, and instead he's been getting with harlots. And this has undermined his missionary efforts. Alma gives him a strong condemnation, and he needs to keep his lusts in check and repent. And it's hard to tell from the text or from events around Joseph whether this is an actual event and who it might be ascribed to. It's possible it could be Joseph himself talking to his younger, iniquitous self, like the priest of Noah in his court, or it could be about Martin Harris and his adultery. We know from an account from the Hales family that Emma's brother talked about how he heard Martin and Joseph talk about how not having, that adultery was no sin. And in that same statement, there's an indication that Joseph did something improper with Emma's friend Abigail Winters. So there's a lot in the text of Alma that could indicate some of his experiences in Harmony, Pennsylvania, that are now making their way into the text, particularly some of those life lessons, some of those condemnations, and also that understanding between the Hale family and Joseph and Emma and the ways in which that dynamic is playing out. But the links are hard to qualify. Now, the rest of the book of Alma, from Alma chapter 43 onwards, and then also most of Helaman, deal with wars. And these end up being huge wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and dissenters from the Nephites who often incite the Lamanites. And one of the greatest names amongst all of these wars is Captain Moroni, who is a particular champion of the people in terms of making sure that they are safe and their liberty is preserved. The book of Helaman then talks about his son Moroni-Ha, who does a very similar thing after him. And I think these 2 groups of wars under these 2 great commanders are really indicative of the American Revolutionary War and then the War of 1812. This was a really big deal in early 19th century America because, of course, this was just the formation of the Republic. This had happened to fathers and grandfathers. Both of Joseph's grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War. Here's a docket for Azel Smith, Joseph Smith Sr.'s father, who fought in the Revolutionary War. And here's a book by Solomon Mack. He talked about his Christian conversion later, but he also talked about his time in the Revolutionary War and also even prior to that in the Indian Wars. The Smith family were incredibly patriotic. They had been New Englanders for centuries. They had fought in the Revolutionary War. They believed in the cause. And we even have a letter from Azel Smith to the family in 1799 really harping on and contending that they should be participant in the new republic and be grateful for this freedom that they enjoy. It's interesting that in Azel Smith's docket, he's designated a captain, and Moroni, this head of the army in Alma, is also Captain Moroni. And we see the header account here for Alma chapter 45, suggesting that this is the end of the book of Alma, talking about these wars. And of course, Helaman picks up with the next wave of wars. But I want to draw your attention to this. This is George Washington in 1775 sending a letter through to the Canadian government, just promoting the idea of freedom and their cause against Britain. Now, I don't know if Joseph read this letter, but there are a number of phrases within this text that end up really closely matching the kinds of things that Captain Moroni says and believes and implements in Alma chapter 46 and Alma chapter 48. You can see them here and here, and there's a number of letters back and forth with the Canadian government that you can see have the same kinds of themes around the same issues that are happening also in these chapters of Alma. So I think there's a really strong correlation between Captain Moroni and George Washington. In his letter to the Canadian government, George Washington describes this purpose for liberty as under the standard of general liberty. And Captain Moroni calls it the title of liberty. And this harkens back to Alma chapter 1, where the people have just been given their liberty with regard to judges, and then there's that immediate threat of kingmen, or men who want to be king, taking the liberty from the people. And all throughout this latter part of the book of Alma, we have these distinctions between kingmen and freemen, those who are fighting for kingdoms and those who are fighting for general liberty and happiness. And this is what happens around the Declaration of Independence, because there are a number of people connected to Britain who want to continue that relationship and those who want to sever it and have their own liberty. This continues right through until the War of 1812, because again, the Federalist Party are suing for that greater relationship, in fact, a reconnection to that relationship, and this is severed with the War of 1812, which then means that this resolve to keep liberty happens and people move forward with the Republic. The other thing that's interesting about these chapters in the end of Alma and through into Helaman is these letters back and forth by leaders suing for their rights and privileges and their path. Because this is exactly what's happening in early America as these different forces on different sides are talking to each other about what it is that they want and how they're going to get it. This fully literate society with epistles and letters back and forth seems more akin to early 19th century America than it does to ancient America that doesn't have this type of express and overwhelmingly written language. After Alma and Helaman, 3rd Nephi is the next book, and there really isn't any autobiographical material in there that I can see, but there are some things that link to what's happening in Joseph's life at the time that are worth just looking at briefly. 3rd Nephi relates the coming of Jesus to the Americas, and one of the things that Jesus advocates for is baptism. And so, according to Lucy Mack Smith, says that when Joseph went to translate, there was a message in the seer stone that said basically he and Oliver should go baptize each other, and so they did that with that same mechanism that we see Alma and Helam do in the land or the waters of Mormon. There is no angelic visitation at this particular time. That is only recorded in 1834 and backdated to 1829 later. But we do have a date for this baptism, and that's May the 15th. And so this gives us a understanding that by this point, Oliver and Joseph are up to the beginning of 3rd Nephi. And 3rd Nephi progresses very quickly because there's a lot of biblical information inserted into the text. We basically see Matthew 5 through to 7 repeated in 3 Nephi 12 through to 14. Now the Matthew 5 portions have a lot of gaps, plus a lot of wording changes. Joseph is making a number of alterations to the text that make it applicable to people in the Americas and the Nephites. And this continues throughout 3 Nephi chapter 12, although the wording changes get smaller. But by the time you get to 3 Nephi chapter 13, it's pretty much just a straight copy. And that's also the case for 3 Nephi chapter 14. I've gone over it before, but 3 Nephi 20 and 21 also have a lot of biblical material. Firstly, Micah chapter 4, Acts chapter 3, Isaiah chapter 52, where there is a lot of this recorded, and then Micah chapter 5, which there is a significant borrowing. Then in 3 Nephi chapter 24, we have Malachi chapter 3, which is pretty much copied word for word, and 3 Nephi chapter 25 is Malachi chapter 4 copied word for word. So this doesn't leave a lot of room for anything much else that Christ does while he's in the Americas. It's pretty bland for a deity who ends up being able to go to a completely different continent and inform people of his understandings and his divinity and things that would single him out as the Son of God. And his arrival into the Americas seems to be problematic because he ends up doing a lot of destruction before he heals the people. And I think, if anything, this is autobiographical because it suggests a really fractious relationship with your Father in heaven. And this is something that Joseph Smith experienced, the idea that at some points he saw his Father as a tyrant and at other points as a redeemer. And so we have a lot of these kind of judgment, destructions type Jesuses from Revelation inserted into the text of 3 Nephi. And then we also see these understandings of Jesus being this deliverer, this redemptive savior, and also this healer, which is also inserted into the text of 3 Nephi. And we also see this treasure digging law go from exactness with regard to procedure when it comes to acquiring treasure, and then exactness and preciseness that comes in with the ordinances of baptism as delivered by Jesus. And so there's a lot of transference of authority from these magical mystic arts through to Christianity. And because Jesus does appear in the Americas, this singles out the Book of Mormon as a divinely Christian work. And for most people, that means that they don't see any of these folk magic aspects or these autobiographical aspects of the Book of Mormon. They just see Jesus. Here's another one of those Arnold Freeberg paintings. This is of Mormon, and you can see that he's sitting on a jaguar print as he inscribes into the gold records. To me, when I'm reading the text of the Book of Mormon, Mormon feels like an afterthought. 4th Nephi covers 300 years in the space of one chapter. And it's Ammoron who hides up the sacred record. In fact, the end of the chapter says that it's the record of Ammoron, and that is the end. I've said this before, but it's worth saying again. I believe that Joseph has fast-tracked the end of the book because he needs to move from Harmony, Pennsylvania, and he's being rescued by David Whitmer, who will take him to Fayette, New York. He doesn't know the Whitmers. They're Oliver's friends, and so he doesn't know what he's going to find, but he's expecting to be reunited with the lost manuscript from Martin Harris, the project be done, and then he can move on. But what he doesn't anticipate is that he can't recover the lost manuscript, and so he has to do a replacement, but also that the Whitmers have been hearing of the adventures through Oliver's letters, and they are converted. And so probably soon after they get to Fayette, they have to recount the whole of the portion that they currently have, which was Mosiah right through to the end of 4th Nephi. And conscious or not, the Whitmers probably alerted Joseph to the fact that there were some plot holes with this ending. One is that who is saying this about Ammoron bearing the records, and who is this person in 3 Nephi chapter 5 who is identified as Mormon, who is the narrator of this text? What is his story? So Joseph has to come up with an understanding of this character Mormon and how he fits into this wider story. And so basically, Joseph recounts his own life. He talks about Ammoron, and that Ammoron identified him as a sober child earlier and told him that when he was about 24 years old, which is the time frame, the age that Joseph is now doing the Book of Mormon, because he's going to turn 24 at the end of this year, 23rd of December 1829, and Ammoron tells him about these plates buried in a hill, even though he's only 10 years old. This seems to be a massive risk to put on the backs of a 10-year-old that you don't know what's going to happen to him in the next 14 years. But apparently, Mormon is named after his father, so he has the same name, Mormon. And being 11 years old, he's carried by his father into the land southward, which seems like the same migration that Joseph Smith Sr. does from Vermont through to western New York. And it seems to be a place that's a lot more industrious than the one he's come from. And that certainly is the case with Joseph too. He comes from basically farmland through to the Erie Canal construction, which is pretty bustling. And then Mormon, at 15 years old, has a visit from the Lord and tastes the goodness of Jesus. And this is the same age that we see in Joseph Smith's 1832 account of his vision. Did Joseph have an experience at 15 that he put into the account of the life of Mormon? Or did talking about this idea of Mormon getting a visitation from God as a 15-year-old, did that then spur him to decide that that's something he wanted to talk about as the first vision evolved through into 1832? One of the other details is he's forbidden to teach and preach to others by God, and this seems to account for the understanding of why Joseph is also not doing a whole lot of preaching right through till basically the Book of Mormon is started. Mormon recounts the idea of slippery treasures and curses on the land and sorcery, all these kinds of things which seem to be around that folk magic tradition that Joseph is growing up in. And at 16, Mormon is chosen because of his large stature to be a leader in their army. This seems like a crazy thing to do to a 16-year-old and something that's not quite in the realm of possibility, but it may have been a great idea and thought of Joseph. Imagine this young leader, particularly in a kind of a biblical worldview, that has been chosen to lead the armies of the righteous. But Mormon is dismayed by the unrighteousness of the people, particularly the Nephites. And that seems to mirror Joseph as well, who is really concerned that they have lost God in his 1832 account of the first vision. And then he goes to the land that Ammoron has deposited the records, and he's able to recover the plates of Nephi, and he's able to add to the account of Nephi things that he wants to be known. And then we see Mormon delve into the second person narrative where he's now talking to the intended audience about his rationale for things, so that the reader will be prepared to stand before the judgment seat of God, testifying to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Then Mormon recovers all the records that are in the hill shim and departs with them, and adds a small abridgment, which I suppose is this, which is being written, which is the small Book of Mormon. But as leader of the armies of the Nephites, he makes a deal with the Lamanites that they will have some time to gather all of their forces to the land of Cumorah by a hill which is called Cumorah. And you can identify this hill because it's in a land of many waters. This is the place that Joseph is growing up, of course, which is the Great Lakes and the Finger Lakes, which means that this area is incredibly rich. And then we learn that Mormon is old, and doing a little bit of calculation, he's 74, and that he's putting all of the records into the hill Cumorah. And he's passing over these small plates to Moroni, who is his son. And it's a bit curious that we don't know much about Mormon except for the details that seem to really correlate with what we know about Joseph Smith at this particular time. Moroni seems to come out of nowhere, because we don't know about a wife, we don't know about children, and suddenly there's a son, but no mother. And this is kind of typical of the Book of Mormon anyway, the erasure of women, but it's also kind of odd because nobody is considering the family apart from this companionship of Mormon as the father and Moroni as the son. Here's the last one, Moroni bearing the records as he comes to the close of the Nephite nation in 421 AD. He is painted as a buff Scandinavian, and this seems to be the image that is embedded into LDS ideology about what the Nephites are. Moroni gets a few verses at the end of Mormon's record, where he says that he will write and hide up the records, and that this is the finish, because there is no more ore, so he can't actually write anymore. And then next thing you know, we have a whole treaty by Moroni in Mormon chapter 8 and 9. What has happened to cause this to come to pass? I think that this is probably directly related to criticism from the extended Smith family. We have a letter from Jesse Smith, who is Joseph's favorite uncle, and he writes a scathing report about the kind of things that he's heard regarding the Book of Mormon coming forth. He calls the project a delusion and a deception, and that it's something that God will have judgment over the Smiths because of. I've done a side-by-side here of that letter with the text of Mormon chapter 8 and 9 written by Moroni. There are a lot of cross ideas, things that are being responded to in the text alongside the kinds of criticisms that Jesse Smith is giving. They're not exactly one for one, so it may have been an earlier letter to the Smiths that Joseph has become aware of and that he is responding to. But there are many themes that seem to be just too close for comfort that suggest that this is a real event that is happening in real time and that Joseph is responding in the voice of Moroni. There is even some wording choices which are quite similar. And Moroni goes on the defensive about the Book of Mormon, its language, its coming forth, its idea of miracles, the idea that God has brought this forth, and the idea that there are sacred records and old ancient languages being utilized, things which Jesse Smith is complaining about being a deception. And then we have the Book of Ether, which is abridged by Moroni. I think this is another one of those plot holes that the Whitmers have made apparent, and that is that back in Mosiah, we knew about these records of these people and that they were supposed to come forth, but they haven't turned up yet. And so Joseph has to imagine Ether and his people and determine and show where they've come from. And so the record starts out with the idea that they're coming from the Tower of Babel and that they have records that go back to Adam, but Moroni's not going to include those. And there seems to be an ending at Ether chapter 4 that Moroni is now commanded to hide up the record. And he's either been reminded or he's thought that he needs some witnesses, and so he talks about how 3 people will come forward to be a testimony and see the records and the angel and be able to testify that this is a work of God. And even though the record kind of finishes here, Moroni then recounts more of the Jaredite history, which seems to mirror lots of the things that happened to the Nephites. I've said this before too, but the record of the Jaredites seems to be a Reader's Digest version of the record of the Nephites and the Lamanites. There's another ending of Moroni's in Ether chapter 12, where he tells you that he has seen Jesus and he commends him to you, all in the second person text that we've talked about before. Then there's a further ending by Ether in Ether chapter 15. And I've shown that this is also the same ending that we see in Mormon chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. But then there's more commentary, including Moroni inserting understandings from Mormon. He puts in there in Moroni chapter 7 a sermon that he gives in a synagogue. I guess he can't do this with his own name for Moroni, or because Moroni is alone. But it's curious that Mormon is told he's not supposed to be teaching the people, and yet here we are having a sermon from him. And one of the problems about this sermon is that it speaks against infant baptism, which seems to be the tiniest of problems when a world is self-destructing around you with these battles between the Nephites and the Lamanites. But also this seems to be a lot more related to 19th century prejudice than it does to ancient America. Moroni includes epistles from his father in Moroni 8 and Moroni 9. And we learn that Moroni is also a general amongst the others with his father. But it does seem weird that there are epistles at all, because who's delivering that mail? And then we have Moroni 10, which is the last ending to the Book of Mormon, put at the very end, and the one that most people read, which, as we've talked about before, mirrors the ending to the replacement text that's given by Amaleki in Omni chapter 1. All these false endings seem to indicate that Joseph is trying desperately to finish the record, but more information comes up, or things that he needs to respond to, and so the prophets, through their voices, address these issues. And we have this curious situation where the details about the history of Joseph Smith that we know are being mirrored with these great compilers. So we have very similar situations between Joseph Smith and Nephi and his account, and Joseph Smith and Mormon and the Mormon abridgment, and we have lots of crossovers between Joseph Smith and Moroni in the Ether abridgment. And we can see Joseph Smith's life also echoed in some of these minor prophets and minor authors in the Book of Mormon, like the brother of Jared, King Mosiah, and Alma the Younger. So I hope that's given a good, solid grounding to the understanding of Joseph in the Book of Mormon. The idea that this is his autobiography, that he's speaking from his own experiences and talking them through these ancient authors. It's pseudepigrapha, which is the idea that you give your own voice weight by ascribing it to somebody ancient who has some authority. But if you have any other ideas or thoughts or things that you think I've missed, or autobiographical information that I've either glossed over or you want more explained, let me know.